We're happy to have J.D. Vance, the author of the best-selling Hillbilly Elegy, in the studios today. And I guess I got to start. J.D., such a trite question. Did you ever expect anything like the response you've gotten to Hillbilly Elegy?
No, definitely not. I told my wife a couple of weeks before the book came out that I just hoped that it wouldn't be embarrassing with how few people read it. And I think that I surpassed that, so I definitely feel pretty good.
How many are in print at this point?
A little over 250,000, so it's going pretty strong.
Those are numbers that policy wonks like me only dream about. J.D., give us a thumbnail sketch of what this book is all about.
Yeah, so the book is really a very focused view of what it's like to grow up white working class in America, specifically with a Scots-Irish background. And so my grandparents went from Kentucky to Southern Ohio, had a lot of optimism about their lives and their future, but as I write in the book, that optimism didn't necessarily pan out. So we've been in some cases a family that's experienced a fair amount of downward mobility, but also obviously in my case a lot of upward mobility because I eventually went on to the Marines and then to Yale Law School. So it's really an exploration at a very personal level of why there aren't more kids who are living lives like I've been able to live.
Listen, I am as Scots-Irish as you are. I have, given the mixed American heritages, I think I got a pretty direct lineage.
Sure.
My Scots-Irish aren't anything like your Scots-Irish. J.D., I don't use the word hillbilly. I talk about country people and that
Sure.
sort of thing, and I've always felt kind of shy about using it, and you used it proudly. Tell me, what is a hillbilly?
Yeah, well, so as my grandma said, a hillbilly is something that we can use in the family, but if somebody else calls you a hillbilly, then you have to punch them in the nose. And the idea is that it's an insider's term of endearment, and the way that we used it in our family is, one, that you had some connection to the land of Appalachia or Appalachia, depending on where you're from, how you say it, that you really love that land, you love the people who live there. And I do think there's a sort of country element to it. It's not just about Appalachia itself, it's sort of about loving the rural lifestyle and having some connection to it, either familial or otherwise.
You've had the book out for a while.
Sure.
You've had all sorts of people do exactly what I did, tell you about how, oh yeah, they came from a similar kind of family and the rest of it. To what extent do you still see the hillbilly culture in which you grew up to be distinct from other white working class environments that people have talked to you about?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I think the answer is that it's still somewhat distinct, and a lot of what we think of as white working class culture, I still think that what we're really talking about sometimes is sort of Scots-Irish or Appalachian-rooted culture. Though obviously there's been so much assimilation that it is sometimes hard to figure out where one stops and the other begins. But there's this interesting argument that we ought to just call it the United States of Appalachia, because a lot of what we think of as sort of classically American values are really rooted in Appalachia in different ways. There's a really good book to that effect. But I think that it's important to sort of recognize, and one thing I've tried to do is recognize that a lot of these issues agree in the broader white working class, but I do still think that there's a lot of connection to Appalachia.
Well, in the census responses, the group of people that responds to the question of what's your ethnicity background, your ethnic background, the ones who say, I'm American, are the Scots-Irish.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Which, in my case, I've always bragged about my Scots-Irish background, and I have said, well, we were violent and we were drunk, but we made great pioneers. I didn't know the half of it until I read your book in terms of all kinds of stuff that goes on in the culture you describe. Question, to what extent, you're a child of the 90s, right?
That's right.
You basically were growing up then. As you listen to your parents and your grandparents, to what extent has the hillbilly culture evolved since 1960?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely evolved almost because it's been forced to evolve, right? So one of the things my grandparents, I think, realized after they moved to Southern Ohio is that a lot of the values that they brought with them didn't necessarily translate into sort of middle-class American life. And that's an understatement. But I think because of that, especially among sort of upwardly mobile folks who have some connection to Scots-Irish or Appalachia, there's definitely an impulse to sort of discard your hillbilliness. There's a recognition that it's maybe something to be ashamed of, or maybe just something that you don't want to highlight. I think it's been really interesting, actually, since the publication of the book, to watch my cousins who both grew up in very sort of middle-class families. They're both in college. One is 21, one is 19, and the way that the book has sort of brought them back in contact with their roots, because they knew my grandma very well, and they didn't realize how much she was a sort of cultural figure and how much they really are part of that culture, even though they don't necessarily see it as something that's broader than themselves.
Are these relatives of yours who are the children of the one, is it Milwaukee he went to, or?
No, so Uncle Jimmy is in Texas. He went from Middletown to Texas to California, back to Texas. These are children of Aunt Wee, who's sort of a very important character in the book.
And to what extent were they aware of the heritage of that they had? Well, you said they didn't know your grandmother was the way she was?
Well, no, they certainly knew the way that she was, and I don't know that they quite placed it in a broader regional and cultural context. And so one of the really interesting things that my cousin did, she wrote this really beautiful piece about my grandma and about sort of recognizing where she came from in the wake of the book coming out. But she even said she sort of tried to hide her hillbilliness. She didn't tell other people about these outrageous family stories, and I didn't either until I got older. I started to appreciate that they were maybe something, unique and interesting, and not something to be just ashamed of. But it was only after I graduated from high school, as I said in the book, a lot of my very good friends heard about these stories for the first time while reading them in the book. It's not something I really bragged about until I got older.
Okay, now tell me though, you get to Yale.
Yeah.
And you write about the ways in which Yale was a different world.
Sure.
Did you ever play the hillbilly card?
Well, I don't know how. I don't think that I ever played the hillbilly card.
You know what I mean? Where all at once you're talking with the deepest Kentucky accent you can come up with, and you're sort of luring other people into having an opinion of you, and then you smack them with some erudite comment they didn't expect.
No, I never quite did that. I mean, I think I tried so hard to fit in and felt a little bit out of place. So I tried to sort of, maybe tried to hide it at the very beginning and never played the hillbilly card. I mean, one of the things I noticed is that it was at Yale that I really lost any semblance of a Southern accent. So it's something that people who knew me when I was a first-year student, not everybody, but they would say, you have a certain way of saying things. Are you from the South? And by the third year of law school, no one made those comments. And so it's interesting that maybe I played the opposite of the hillbilly card. I became, at least in the way that I spoke, a little bit more like the elites than folks back home.
I advise you to retain those skills. We have a friend from Macomb, Georgia. She a female in her 30s, and she is usually crisp and snap. She could pass for a New Yorker almost. Mm-hmm. But if she's in a situation where all at once that sweet Southern accent is really effective, it comes on in a flash, really and she gets great mileage out of it. Okay, here's something that, as the author of The Bell Curve, I have to bring up. Dick Hernstein and I spent a lot of time documenting the relationship of IQ to impulse control and delayed gratification and thinking ahead to long-term consequences, and those correlations are real. And your mother certainly was pretty smart. She reported to you, I guess, that she was salutatorian, and in any case, she was academically successful. You got through high school, despite not being a model student in all respects. You got through the Marine Corps, through Ohio State, and then up to Yale Law School.
Sure.
Impulse control doesn't really describe your family's life in the book, and neither does delayed gratification
Sure.
or wise decision. What was going on with all of the ability that was in that family where so many strange decisions were made?
Yeah, well, I guess impulse control maybe is all relative, and relative to some of my grandparents' ancestors, they were probably pretty good on that front. I definitely think that a lot of the people in my family were definitely really smart, but I will say that they weren't smart in a way that I found especially unique in the broader community. And this is one of the things I've sort of struggled with is, did I just sort of get lucky and I had smart family? I really don't think so. I didn't feel growing up that I was an especially smart kid. I didn't feel like an idiot. I felt maybe above average relative to the people that I went to high school with. And one of the things that seemed to drive success more than sort of hard IQ numbers was the delayed gratification and the impulse control, and also just a sense of like willfulness. You know, a lot of people don't think in these communities that if they work hard, they're actually going to get ahead. And that was a really important component, I think, of why so many kids didn't do that well coming from the high school that I came from. So I'm probably not providing a very satisfactory answer, but it's definitely the case, I think, that I benefited a lot from some of the impulses of my grandparents, especially. But I also think that it's what seemed to really count back home was maybe what you might call non-cognitive skills as opposed to the more hard IQ numbers.
Could I just observe that that your experience, I think, would be ones that some of your fellow students at Yale could use, which is to say, you had a sense that you were maybe above average, but you weren't paying too much attention to that kind of thing. And you also do not convey that you had a sense that you were surrounded by a bunch of people that you couldn't talk to because they weren't smart enough.
Right.
No sense of that at all.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the problems we have these days is that a lot of your fellow students at Yale have never known anybody except the same kinds of people they were. And they think of a person who has an average IQ or an IQ of 95, and they think, oh, they must be impossible to deal with. And you can teach a lot in that regard.
Yeah, and I think I'd have sort of two responses to that feeling that a lot of folks do have, and I agree with you. You know, one is that common sense is really undervalued in society, and a lot of folks with an IQ of 95 or 85 have a lot of common sense, even if they don't have fancy degrees, and that's really important. The other thing I'd say is that people maybe overstate how smart they are when they get to Yale. I think it's, I think that there's this impulse to be a little self-congratulatory about where you came from. And one of the ways to do that is to just say, I'm more meritocratic, I'm smarter than the people who didn't make it, I'm better in whatever way, however you want to measure it. And my sense is that that's probably not true. My general impression of the kids that I went to Yale Law School with is that they were pretty smart, certainly above average, but what that really set them apart was that they were ambitious and very hardworking. That was what really surprised me and seemed out of place. Their intelligence didn't seem otherworldly to me. Their work ethic and their ambition definitely did.
You are out in San Francisco now, right?
That's right.
Working for Peter Thiel?
Yeah, I work at one of the venture capital funds that he co-founded.
You are in a very different world, both from Middletown and Kentucky, and different from Yale.
Sure.
You are married, you are going to be successful. Are you going to be encased in a bubble pretty soon, whereby you are a Silicon Valley guy and your children won't know anything about Middletown and Kentucky unless you take proactive steps?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I really worry about. You know, the biggest culture shock that I've had wasn't at Yale, it was in Silicon Valley. And what was so shocking about it is how optimistic people are. There's just this sense of sort of boundless, the world is always going to get better, and even we're going to be the people who help make it better. And that's so weird and so different from the place that I grew up in. And my answer to your question is absolutely I'm worried about it. I'm really worried that my kids will share really nothing about my background, will have no idea where they came from on that side of the family, will have no appreciation for what a hillbilly is or why I might think it's a good thing and not just something to be sneered at and pointed at. And so, yeah, I think that I'll definitely have to take affirmative steps if I want to prevent that from happening. And it's one of the reasons why I keep on asking my wife, when can we move back to Ohio? and the other thing I'll say about that, you know, that living in the bubble, it's not just about not appreciating where you came from. It's also a certain failure to recognize how truly blessed some of these people are who grew up in these Ivy League families, these Ivy League institutions. It's really, really easy to feel super disconnected from how the rest of the country lives. And I don't want my kids to feel like that. I really worry about that. And it's one of the things that I take as really a sort of blessing from the way that I grew up, is that I at least appreciate how other people are living their lives. And hopefully I never lose that. Hopefully my family doesn't either.
I think a summer place in Kentucky is what you're going to need, where you go there every year, and when you don't get in your private jet, you drive and you stay at Motel 6s. I think the kids will work it all out.
I've forced my wife to stay in a fair number of Motel 6s, and it's because, you know, they're outdoors, so we always travel with our two dogs. You can always sneak a couple of dogs into a Motel 6, so they have their advantages.